In the heart of an ancient forest, nestled in a secluded cabin, lived an old widow named Eleanor. She was a woman of quiet strength, her years spent in harmony with nature, tending to her small garden and feeding the birds that flocked to her porch. But one fateful winter morning, as she trudged through the snow-covered woods, she stumbled upon something that would change her life forever. A tiny, shivering bear cub, alone and helpless. Its mother was nowhere to be found, and the little creature's pitiful cries pierced the cold silence. Eleanor's heart ached at the sight. She knew that without help, the cub wouldn't survive the merciless winter. With careful hands, she wrapped the trembling ball of fur in her woolen shawl and carried it home. At first, the cub was frightened, its dark eyes darting with fear. It refused to eat, curling up in a corner of the cabin, its tiny body racked with exhaustion. But Eleanor was patient. She warmed milk over the fireplace and fed the cub with a spoon, whispering soothing words as she cradled it in her arms. As days passed, the little bear began to trust her, its whimpers replaced with contented purrs as it nuzzled into her lap. Eleanor named him Brutus. Raising a wild bear was no easy task, yet Eleanor embraced the challenge with unwavering devotion. Brutus grew quickly, his once fragile frame strengthening into a towering beast. But despite his immense size, he remained gentle with Eleanor, always mindful of the frail woman who had saved his life. They became inseparable, wandering the woods together, sharing meals, and keeping each other company through long, lonely nights. Yet, as time passed, Eleanor's body grew weaker, her once steady hands trembling as she stroked Brutus's thick fur. She knew her time was drawing near, but what would become of the bear she had raised as her own? No one could have predicted what Brutus would do when Eleanor took her final breath. The wind howled through the towering pines, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. Eleanor pulled her thick shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way through the dense forest, her cane pressing into the fresh snow with each step. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the frozen ground. She had been out gathering firewood when a faint sound reached her ears, a weak, pitiful whimper. She stopped, listening carefully. There was again, a soft, desperate cry carried by the wind, so fragile it almost blended into the rustling trees. Her heart clenched. Following the sound, Eleanor pushed through the underbrush, her breath rising in soft puffs of white. Then, beneath the bare branches of a fallen tree, she saw it, a small, shivering ball of fur, barely visible against the snow. A bear cub, no bigger than a house cat, lay curled up, its tiny body heaving with exhaustion. Its fur was damp, clumped with ice, and its dark eyes were glazed with fear. Eleanor scanned the area, searching for the mother, but the forest was eerily silent. There were no tracks in the snow except for the cubs, leading from the distant hills where hunters often roamed. A deep sadness settled in her chest. The poor creature had likely been orphaned, its mother taken by the cruel hands of men who never saw the life behind the eyes of the animals they hunted. Eleanor crouched slowly, careful not to startle the cub. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, her voice gentle, soothing. The cub flinched, but didn't have the strength to move away. It was too weak, too cold. Without hesitation, Eleanor unwrapped her woolen shawl and draped it over the tiny creature. The cub let out a soft, broken whimper as she carefully gathered it into her arms. Its small body was cold against her chest, its heartbeat faint but steady. "You're safe now," she whispered, cradling it close. With careful steps, she made her way back to the cabin, her heart pounding. She could feel the cub's shallow breaths against her skin. Time was against them. If she didn't warm it up soon, it wouldn't make it through the night. As soon as she reached the cabin, Eleanor pushed the door open and hurried inside. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the rustic wooden walls. She knelt beside the fireplace, still holding the cub close. She grabbed a thick blanket and wrapped it snugly around the tiny creature, then filled a small bowl with warm milk. Using a spoon, she gently pressed it to the cub's lips. At first, It resisted, its tiny nose twitching as it let out a weak, frightened sound. But Eleanor was patient. "Come on, little one," she cooed. "Just a little sip." After a few tense moments, the cub's pink tongue flicked out hesitantly, lapping at the milk. Relief flooded through Eleanor. She continued to feed it slowly, murmuring soft reassurances as the cub took tentative sips. Hours passed, and the little bear remained curled up in her lap, its shivers gradually subsiding. Eleanor ran her wrinkled fingers through its damp fur, whispering the same comforting words she had once spoken to her own children long ago. As the fire crackled beside them, a fragile bond began to form, a silent promise between a woman who had lost much and a creature that had lost everything. That night, for the first time since her husband had passed, Eleanor didn't feel alone, and neither did the bear. The night after Eleanor rescued the bear cub, the little creature remained curled up by the fireplace, wrapped in thick blankets. Though it had stopped shivering, its dark eyes still held the weight of fear, darting around the cabin warily. Every unfamiliar sound, the creak of the wooden walls, the crackling fire, made it flinch. But the cub wasn't the only one watching. From the corner of the room, perched atop an old rocking chair, Eleanor's tabby cat, Oliver, stared at the newcomer with unblinking golden eyes. Oliver had been Eleanor's companion for years, a proud and independent creature who ruled the cabin as his own. He had seen foxes sniff around the porch, squirrels dart across the roof, and owls hoot from the treetops. But never before had his domain been invaded by a bear. At first, Oliver made his feelings clear. His tail twitched in annoyance, his ears flicking backward as he observed the intruder. When the cub whimpered softly in its sleep, Oliver let out an irritated huff, leaping down from his chair and stalking closer. His paw steps were silent, his sleek body moving with the grace of a hunter. Eleanor, rocking gently in her chair, watched the encounter unfold. She expected Oliver to hiss, to swat at the cub in warning, but instead he stopped just inches away, sniffing cautiously. The bear cub stirred, its tiny black nose twitching as it caught Oliver's scent. Slowly, it lifted its head, blinking sleepily at the strange creature before it. For a long moment, neither moved. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. Then, Oliver did something unexpected. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out a single paw, claws tucked in, and bopped the cub on the nose. The little bear let out a startled squeak, pulling its head back in surprise. Eleanor chuckled softly. "Well, that's one way to say hello," she murmured. Oliver sat back, curling his tail neatly around his paws. His golden eyes never left the cub, but the stiffness in his posture eased. He wasn't sure what to make of this strange, fumbling creature, but he seemed to decide, for now, that it was no threat. Over the next few days, their interactions became a dance of cautious curiosity. The cub, whom Eleanor had officially named Brutus, remained wary of the feline at first. Whenever Oliver got too close, Brutus would freeze, his round ears flattening slightly. But Oliver, being a cat, was persistent. He began inching closer each night, curling up just a bit nearer to the cub as they lay by the fire. One particularly cold evening, Oliver made his boldest move yet. As Brutus slept soundly, his small body still dwarfed by Eleanor's blankets, Oliver stretched lazily and patted over. Without hesitation, he climbed onto the pile of blankets and nestled himself against the cub's warm fur. Brutus stirred, his sleepy eyes flickering open. For a moment, he seemed unsure, his body tensing slightly. But then Oliver began to purr, a deep, soothing vibration that filled the quiet cabin like a lullaby. Something in Brutus relaxed. He let out a soft, contented sigh and shifted slightly, pressing closer to the warmth of the little cat beside him. Eleanor watched with a warm smile, her heart swelling at the sight. "Well, look at you too," she murmured. "I guess even the wildest of hearts need a friend." As days turned into weeks, their bond only grew. Oliver became Brutus's unlikely mentor, showing him the rules of cabin life. He taught the cub how to bat at loose strings with careful precision, how to pounce on fallen leaves that fluttered through the open door, and, Most importantly, how to demand attention from Eleanor by rubbing insistently against her legs. Brutus, in turn, followed Oliver everywhere. He mimicked the cat's movements with clumsy enthusiasm, though his growing size made him far less graceful. When Oliver leaped onto the windowsill to watch the snow fall, Brutus attempted the same, only to tumble backward with a startled grunt. When Oliver curled up on Eleanor's lap for an afternoon nap, Brutus tried to do the same, resulting in a breathless laugh from Eleanor as she was nearly squashed under his weight. Despite their differences, they had become inseparable. One evening, as a fierce winter storm raged outside, Eleanor sat knitting by the fire, the rhythmic clicking of her needles filling the warm cabin. By her feet, Brutus and Oliver lay curled together, their bodies entwined in a tangle of fur. The sight filled Eleanor's heart with an overwhelming sense of peace. Life had a way of bringing together the most unexpected companions: an old widow, an orphan bear, and a stubborn cat. Against all odds, they had found comfort in one another, bound by something deeper than words, a shared understanding of loneliness, of love, and of the simple warmth that came from knowing they were no longer alone. And in that moment, as the fire crackled and the storm howled outside, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. No matter what the future held, they had each other, and that was enough. Winter melted into spring, and the once fragile cub, Brutus, grew stronger by the day. His once wobbly legs became sturdy, his fur thick and glossy, and his tiny paws, once soft and clumsy, now carried a hint of the great strength he would one day possess. Yet despite his growing size, one thing remained unchanged: his unwavering attachment to Oliver. At first, Brutus had simply followed the cat out of curiosity, his instincts unsure of what to make of his feline companion. But as time passed, it became clear that Brutus saw Oliver as something more: a teacher, a guide, and perhaps even an older brother. Wherever Oliver went, Brutus followed. Eleanor often chuckled at the sight of her unlikely duo, the lean, confident tabby strutting across the wooden floor with a regal air, and just a few steps behind, a clumsy bear cub trying his best to imitate him. One afternoon, as golden sunlight poured through the cabin windows, Oliver perched lazily on the windowsill, watching the birds flit through the trees outside. Brutus, too large to fit beside him, sat below, his big brown eyes fixed on his mentor. Then, in an almost comedic display of determination, he attempted to climb up onto the windowsill, his large paws scrabbling against the wood. With a flick of his tail, Oliver glanced down, watching with mild amusement as Brutus struggled. The cub grunted, his muscles straining, but gravity won out. With a thud, he landed back on the floor, huffing in frustration. Eleanor laughed. "You might have to settle for the ground view, big guy." Oliver, perhaps feeling magnanimous, stretched out a paw and gently batted at Brutus's nose in a gesture of camaraderie. The cub chuffed in response, bumping his nose against Oliver's outstretched paw. As the days warmed, Eleanor took to sitting on the porch in the afternoons, watching Brutus and Oliver explore the small meadow behind the cabin. Oliver moved with practiced agility, slinking through the grass with the effortless grace of a seasoned hunter. Brutus, on the other hand, was all youthful energy, bounding after the cat in an awkward, lumbering fashion. One day, Oliver crouched low, eyes locked onto a fluttering butterfly that had landed on a patch of wildflowers. With precise control, he inched forward, his tail twitching in anticipation. Brutus watched, his ears perked in fascination. Then, just as Oliver prepared to pounce, thud! Brutus, lacking his friend's patience, barreled forward in an attempt to catch the butterfly himself. His massive paws flattened the flowers, sending the startled insect fluttering away. Oliver sat back with an unimpressed flick of his ears as Brutus looked around, confused, as if wondering where his prize had gone. Eleanor laughed so hard she had to wipe a tear from her eye. "Brutus, my dear, I don't think stealth is your strong suit." But Oliver, despite his initial annoyance, didn't seem to hold a grudge. That evening, as the sun set and the cool night air settled in, he curled up beside Brutus once more, purring softly as the cub let out a contented sigh. Their bond was no longer just about companionship. It had become something deeper, something unspoken. Oliver taught Brutus patience, while Brutus taught Oliver the comfort of warmth and closeness. They were opposites in so many ways, yet they fit together perfectly, like two pieces of a puzzle. One night, as a gentle rain drummed against the roof, Eleanor woke to find that her old bones ached more than usual. She sat up in bed, rubbing her stiff fingers, when she noticed something that made her heart swell. On the floor beside her bed, Oliver was curled into a tight ball, his tail flicking ever so slightly in his sleep. But what touched her most was the sight of Brutus, now much larger than before, curled protectively around Oliver, his massive paw draped over the tiny cat as if shielding him from the night. Eleanor's throat tightened. She had always believed that love could take many forms, that family wasn't just about blood, but about the connections that bound souls together. Watching the two of them, the little cat and the growing bear, she knew with certainty that they had become something more than just unlikely friends. They were family. And as Brutus let out a deep, sleepy sigh and Oliver purred softly beside him, Eleanor whispered into the quiet night, "You two were meant to find each other." And perhaps, in a way, they were all meant to find one another. As the seasons passed, Brutus grew bigger, much bigger. No longer the tiny, helpless cub Eleanor had rescued. He now stood on powerful legs, his body thick with muscle and fur. Though he still had the heart of the playful, affectionate bear who had once tumbled across the wooden floor, his size alone made things more complicated. The first sign of trouble came one afternoon when Brutus, in his usual excitement, attempted to playfully bat at Oliver. His massive paw, once small and delicate, now sent Oliver skidding across the floor. The startled cat hissed, arching his back as his fur puffed up in alarm. Brutus immediately pulled back, his ears flattening. He let out a low, distressed whimper, his large brown eyes full of regret. He hadn't meant to scare Oliver. Eleanor watched the exchange with a gentle smile. "You don't know your own strength, do you, my dear?" she murmured, reaching out to stroke Brutus's fur. For the first time, Brutus hesitated to approach Oliver. He sat back, watching as the cat cautiously licked his ruffled fur, seemingly deciding whether to forgive the clumsy bear. Brutus let out a small chuff, lowering his head in apology. After a long pause, Oliver, still proud, still stubborn, slowly sauntered forward and brushed against Brutus's leg. It was his way of saying, "You're forgiven, but be careful next time." Brutus let out a relieved huff and gently, ever so gently, nuzzled the cat's side. Their bond had been tested, but it was not broken. One stormy evening, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the old cabin's wooden walls. The thunder rumbled low and deep, shaking the very ground beneath them. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, watching the fire flicker in the hearth, while Oliver curled in her lap. But Brutus was restless. Despite his size, he still carried remnants of his cub-like fears. He paced near the door, flinching at every crash of thunder, his thick body tense. Eleanor could see the nervous twitch in his ears, the way he kept looking toward the door as if unsure whether to hide or run. Oliver, who had once feared Brutus's strength, now seemed to sense his unease. He leapt from Eleanor's lap and padded toward the trembling bear. Without hesitation, he brushed against Brutus's side, then curled up right between his large paws, purring softly. Brutus stilled. The steady vibration of Oliver's purring, the simple warmth of his tiny body pressed against him, seemed to ground him. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed, and he let out a deep sigh. Eleanor smiled. They take care of each other now. As Brutus continued to grow, so did his instincts. One crisp autumn morning, Eleanor stepped outside to gather herbs from her garden when a pair of distant eyes glowed from the tree-line. A lone wolf, thin and hungry, had wandered too close to the cabin, its gaze locked onto Oliver, who was lounging lazily on the porch. Brutus, who had been dozing near the doorway, lifted his head. The moment he saw the wolf, something changed. His playful nature vanished, replaced by something deep and primal. He rose to his full height, letting out a low, guttural growl that sent vibrations through the ground. The wolf hesitated, but Brutus did not. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, placing himself between Oliver and the predator. His massive frame blocked the path completely, his message clear: "You will not touch him." The wolf held Brutus's gaze for only a moment before slinking back into the forest. Oliver, seemingly unfazed, gave a lazy flick of his tail before hopping onto Brutus's back, as if nothing had happened. Eleanor let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "You really are his guardian, aren't you?" Brutus let out a contented huff, gently lowering himself back down. Oliver curled up between his paws, as he always did, their bond now stronger than ever. No matter what challenges they faced, they had each other, and that would always be enough. The first snow of winter had just begun to fall, dusting the treetops in a soft, white glow. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair by the fire, knitting quietly as Brutus and Oliver lay curled together on the thick rug. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them like a familiar embrace. Then came a sound. A sharp crack echoed through the forest, followed by the unmistakable echo of gunfire. Brutus's head shot up, his ears twitching. Oliver's fur bristled, and he let out a low growl. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She knew that sound all too well. Hunters. Before she could stop him, Brutus was on his feet, pushing through the door with startling force. "Brutus, no," Eleanor called, her voice shaking, but he was already gone, his massive form disappearing into the trees. Oliver hesitated for only a second before darting after him. The forest was alive with tension. Brutus charged forward, his powerful strides kicking up snow as he followed the scent of something unfamiliar, something dangerous. The echo of voices carried through the trees, men laughing, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. Brutus slowed as he neared the clearing, his instincts warring within him. He had never faced men before, only known the warmth of Eleanor's kindness. But deep down, in the marrow of his bones, something told him that these men were not like her. A rustling behind him made him turn. Oliver had caught up, his golden eyes wide with warning. He let out a sharp growl, almost as if telling Brutus to stop, to turn back. But then Brutus saw it. A young deer, its flank torn by a bullet, struggling to rise in the snow. The hunters were closing in, their rifles raised, their laughter cruel. Something snapped inside Brutus. With a deep, rumbling roar, he stepped forward, standing his ground between the hunters and the wounded animal. The men froze. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, one of them lifted his rifle. Oliver moved first. In a flash of fur, the cat leapt onto the hunter's back, claws sinking into his coat. The man yelped, flailing wildly. In that moment of distraction, Brutus reared onto his hind legs, letting out a deafening roar that shook the trees. The hunters panicked. "Holy hell, it's huge," one shouted, stumbling backward. "Forget the deer, let's get out of here." Within seconds, they were gone, bolting into the woods, their rifles forgotten in the snow. Brutus stood still for a moment, his breath coming in heavy puffs of steam. Then he felt a soft brush against his leg. Oliver. The cat nudged him, his usual smugness replaced with something quieter, something understanding. They had faced danger together, and they had won. Brutus let out a soft huff, lowering himself back onto all fours. As Oliver climbed onto his back, the two turned toward home, toward Eleanor, toward the place where they truly belonged. By the time Brutus and Oliver returned to the cabin, the fire was still glowing, casting a golden warmth over the wooden floors. Eleanor stood at the door, her weathered hands clutched together in relief. "Oh, my boys," she whispered as Brutus lumbered toward her, his massive form now towering over the woman who had once cradled him as a cub. Oliver hopped down from Brutus's back and rubbed against Eleanor's legs, as if to reassure her that they were both safe. Brutus let out a soft, rumbling sigh and lowered his head, pressing his large snout gently into Eleanor's outstretched hands. She smiled, stroking his fur. "You protected each other, didn't you?" she murmured. Brutus chuffed in response, his deep brown eyes full of understanding. Oliver, ever the proud companion, hopped onto Brutus's broad back once more and gave Eleanor a slow, deliberate blink, his own way of confirming that, yes, they had faced something dangerous together. And they had won. The winter passed, and, as the snow melted into spring, Brutus grew into his full size. He was no longer a cub, but a powerful, majestic bear. Though he could no longer fit inside the cabin the way he once had, he never strayed far. Every morning, he waited by the porch for Eleanor to step outside, nudging her hand gently in greeting. Every night, he lay curled up just beyond the door, Oliver curled atop his thick fur, the two of them still inseparable. Eleanor often sat on her rocking chair, watching them in the fading light of the evening. The sight of them together, the enormous bear and the tiny cat, never ceased to warm her heart. She had rescued Brutus when he was weak and afraid, and in turn, he had found his own strength, not just in size, but in love, in loyalty, in the bond he shared with Oliver. As the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Eleanor smiled to herself. Some bonds were written in blood. Others, like theirs, were written in the quiet moments of trust, of protection, and of an unbreakable love. And no matter what the future held, she knew one thing for certain. Brutus and Oliver would always have each other. Always.